Hello, I'm Furuya with Gekihana. Today, actually, I'm here at the workplace of Christmas rose grower Mr. Yokoyama. Mr. Yokoyama, hello. He's well known in the industry. I can actually come here in about an hour from my office. Today, what we're going to talk about is this. Dun dun! Christmas rose. So I'm going to bombard him with questions about Christmas rose. The questions I'm going to ask today will include, we cut leaves when buds start to form, but why do we do that? How should we deal with roots when we replant? And one I get asked a lot lately is, the Christmas rose buds droop after frost, so what should we do? How to fertilize? When it comes to Christmas rose, he's like a professor. So I'm going to ask Mr. Yokoyama all these questions. Okay. So Mr. Yokoyama, I'm very excited. With this Christmas rose, when the flower buds start to come in, there are flower buds here. People tend to prefer when the leaves are fully grown in, right? When a lot of average customers come in, they say, it's got no leaves. Are these leaves in the way? Well, you can't see the flowers like this. Well, you can't see any of them, although they're blooming. A lot of people ask what they should do here. The advice I'd like to give is this. Well, there's a tendency for new leaves to grow where the leaves are. New leaves start to grow in, and the old leaves, of course, look dirty. This is after I've removed them already. But sometimes you get new leaves growing in along with flower buds like this. These leaves are a bit problematic. When you get a lot of these leaves, it can make the flowers smaller or prevent blooming from a lack of nutrients. In other words, the nutrients go to the leaves. The nutrients go to the leaves, and the flowers don't get the nutrients, so you don't get good blossoms. That's what happens, so what you should do in this case... Can you hold this? Okay. For example, regardless of whether they be new leaves growing in the fall, when the flowers begin to bud, you prune the leaves like crazy. So you prune like crazy whether they're new leaves or old. Right, you prune the new leaves and the old leaves. Then the flowers will get plenty of nutrients. Shouldn't you show this side of the camera? This way. I'm over here cutting on the back side. Then over here too. So you prune it all away. Right, you prune like crazy. You want to cut it about 5 to 10 centimeters above the soil line. If you have these, you can't see anything, so you cut it like this. Okay. When you say 5 centimeters above the soil line, why do you leave the stems like that? If you cut it too short, this here that you cut can potentially mold the stem. If you cut it too short, germs can get in from here, or it can collect extra moisture and can rot or get gray mold and things. So if you cut it with some stem remaining, after a while it turns into like a twig. It's like a dry twig. It becomes like a dry twig, right? You have some here, right? Right, just like that. If you give it about a month, it'll get like this. Then you can pull it out just like I did, or you can leave it and it won't do any harm. Yeah, but this is what you want to do. And this is how it looks now. You see the flowers. Now you can see all the flowers, and the flowers will get the nutrients. And it'll grow nice and straight for the most part. Now, these days, you know how Christmas rose stems usually grow longer? There are also a lot that don't grow much. Is that because the leaves are blocking the sunlight or something? When it's like that, the leaves take the nutrients and the flowers will stay low. Also, when it starts to bloom, it's cold and will stay short. And it's even possible that the flower stems won't grow because it's not getting enough water. Christmas rose is actually native to Europe, and it's rainy season there right now. So winter is the rainy season in Europe. It's the time of year it gets the most moisture, so it absorbs plenty of moisture at that time and grows nice and tall. So you can't let it be short on water, especially since here in the Kanto region, winter time is dry. Right, it's reversed. And we get dry winds and things, so they tend to stay short. Conversely, where it snows a lot in Tohoku or near the Sea of Japan, they absorb plenty of water when the snow melts and will grow like crazy at that time. So for those with potted plants in this season, underwatering they'll want to watch for it. In that case, just how often should they water it? Fundamentally, it's when it dries, but you want the bottom to always stay moist. It's okay for the bottom to stay moist. If it's dripping wet, it might rot. You want to water when the surface dries. So rather than waiting for it to completely dry, you water when the soil on the surface dries. So that's how you manage watering when the bulbs come in. Right. Now, people want the flowers to grow, so a lot of people want to fertilize. Is it okay to fertilize at this time? You don't want to fertilize at this time. The reason for that is the flowers. You want to do it before and after. So before they begin to bud and after the flowers bloom, that's when you want to fertilize. If you fertilize at the wrong time, of course you might get mold at the base of the plant, but this here that looks like leaves, rather they look like flowers, it's called the calyx, and it's actually part of the leaves. These can get a darker color. The fertilizer can also affect the shape and color of the flowers. It can change the color of the flowers. Also, you'll keep getting more sprouting. So at this time, you want to allow the plant to bloom on its own and then fertilize it afterwards. And I forgot to mention it earlier, I prune off all the new leaves, and a lot of people get worried. But after the flowers bloom, new little stems will start to sprout here. Right, it's growing here. It's a little hard to see, but they're there. It's these here, like these right here. Things like these will grow out after the flowers bloom. They'll grow in from below. They'll start growing buds for the next year, so you prune the flowers early on and let the new stems grow. So you want to fight the urge to keep the flowers on forever and prune the flowers early on. You definitely should, yes. So you know how seeds form here? Should we prune the flowers once the seeds form? You actually want to prune it before the seeds form. If you really want to maximize blooming, you should let all the buds bloom. Then once the last bud blooms, that's when you prune. That's a tough one. You want to enjoy the flowers even more. A lot of people do. So at a minimum, when the cherry blossoms are blooming, it gets to be too full and begin to wither a bit, and new sprouts begin to come in. Not the stems for the buds, but the stems for the leaves will grow in, so you want to prune it at that time. So you want to prune it once by the time the cherry blossoms are in bloom. Should you take the seeds off when you prune? There are those who go through the effort of taking the seeds. There are those who want to do that, and that's much better than not doing it, but ideally, you want to take the flowers off. What's even better is if you prune it down to about 10 centimeters high altogether. Then it allows the stems to grow even better. At that time, you want the nutrients to go to the leaves. In our current season, nutrients to the flowers. Once the flowers have all bloomed, the nutrients to the leaves, and for fertilizer before and after blooming is when you fertilize. The chemical fertilizer is fine, right? Chemical fertilizer is fine for potted plants. How about ground planting? If it's planted in the ground, you definitely want organic fertilizer. Oh, what's the reason for that? You know how they only contain certain ingredients? Chemical fertilizers, right. They call it NPK. Right, there's almost no trace elements. Since they don't, in order to make the soil really good, you have to put animal-based or plant-based compost into the ground to make it really good. So, in order to enjoy them year after year, you want to add either organic fertilizer or compost. Absolutely, Ryan. If planting in soil, it's probably sufficient to fertilize just once during the fall. If you fertilize too much during the summer or during the spring, it takes effect during the summer. Right, so you have to be careful there. Because if it takes effect when it's hot, it can destroy the roots. Right. Now, when it comes to replanting, will this come out? This, probably not, right? It's too big. If there's a small one, I like to take a look at the roots. Now we like our usual root check. Let's take a look. The roots are already all around there. It's all grown in here. So you can just replant this as is, and it'll be better than not replanting at all, but really you want to loosen the roots before replanting. That way they'll grow better. Okay, does that mean it's okay to cut these roots? During this season, when the flowers are blooming and the sprouts are coming in, this here is a leafy sprout. As I said earlier, this is when they want moisture, so since it can't absorb moisture if you cut the roots, you don't want to cut the roots in this season. So then, when is the ideal season for replanting? When it gets a little warmer in March, or when the cherry blossoms are blooming, then you can really go to town on it. So, you first want to prune the flowers at cherry blossom time, and then replant it. Right. And then fertilize it. Right. Actually, the ideal time to replant it is in the fall. Oh, so it's best to replant it in the fall and wait for the flowers. That would be the best. And if you inadvertently allow it to bloom even though the roots are packed, it's too late, so you wait for the cherry blossoms before you do it. Right, it can be a bit before the cherry blossoms. You have to keep an eye on it. Out of curiosity, I think there's a fundamental reason why we need to replant in the first place. I think everyone recognizes that roots getting overgrown is bad. But do you ever wonder why having overgrown roots is bad? Let's ask that now. How about it? First, when there's a lot of root, there's not a lot of soil. So you lose the environment where the roots can absorb the fertilizer, and if it gets overgrown, it can't grow new roots. Then it's like it's hindering its own growth. So it'll get to a point where it won't bloom well. And when it's all packed together, you get a lot of small leaves popping up. Like it's struggling. It can't get nutrients. So it pops up a bunch of small leaves and will stop blooming. So if you leave it with overgrown roots, it'll grow fewer flowers. Not just fewer, but you'll get a bunch of small leaves and no flowers. You especially get this with potted plants. How often should you replant it, and how big? This is about a number 5 pot, right? 4.5. 4.5, okay. With something like this, every year, one like this, put in about a 18 centimeter, number 6. About a number 6. And then, if it gets to about this size, you can probably keep it for 3 or 4 years, about a number 7 or 8 pot. So you want to bring it up a size about every year? One size every year or every 2 years? Every 2 years. That would be good. So you want to look at the state of the roots from the bottom of the pot or something. You want to do something like that? This one isn't overgrown or anything and looks fine. Right. If your Christmas rose isn't doing well, you want to look not only on the surface but at the roots as well. A lot of the times, you can find the cause or figure out what you need to do from there. But like I said, if you get a bunch of small leaves, the leaves get thinner or the color becomes thinner, it's very likely that it's due to a lack of fertilizer or the roots are overgrown. Then you want to replant. Right. So I would want to replant this by this coming spring at the latest. Why? We want to replant since the roots are all packed together. Now, lastly, when you get frost, you know how the sprouts can sort of droop like it's wilting? I think some people panic and pour water on it. I'd like to ask about that as well. For example, you have one that's blooming nicely here. It's up right now. When it gets really cold like it did in the last few days, this will be drooping when you wake up in the morning. Right. It looks like it's withering like it's out of water. But if you look at it here, it's moist, but it's drooping. The reason for that is when the Christmas rose freezes in this state, the cells burst and it ends up damaging the plant. Then, To make itself more resistant to frost, it stores the moisture in the roots. Okay. So it intentionally dehydrates itself. So on its own, it sends water down to the roots, and it itself droops like it needs water. Okay. Then when it gets warm, it'll recover right away and will come right back up. By 9 or 5 o'clock, when it gets sunlight, it returns right away. So you don't want to water at that time. So you shouldn't water it then. If you melt it quickly, it can destroy the cells. So you want to leave it drooping. It'll be drooping, and if you water it then, it'll continue to droop down, and it might not recover. It's possible. It's not so delicate of a plant, but you definitely don't want to panic and give it warm water or anything to defrost it. It will recover because it returns gradually. I see. You know how there's a lot of people who set it directly on concrete, like at their doorsteps? Then the concrete gets really cold in the morning, and the cold comes from below as well, and it droops like that. So that's the same thing, right? Same thing. Another thing I'll say is that, as I said, it's putting the moisture in its roots. Then it takes moisture from the roots to stand back up. So when it's blooming like this, if you damage the roots, like you cut roots or loosen it when replanting, it won't be able to move the moisture up and down, and it might stay drooping. So you want to replant when it's a bit warmer. Oh, so that's part of it. It's all connected. Now, for example, you know how Christmas rose is sold a lot in this season, February to March. Now, if the one you buy has overgrown roots, a lot of people will say it's a pity and go ahead and replant immediately after they buy it. And if they scrape up the roots when they do so, then if they do that, it's possible that it might not recover after it droops down. Right. Conscientious people will have to be careful, and cold waves can come suddenly, so you need to make sure it can withstand it. Also, for example, in places like Niigata or Fukushima, or other places known to be higher elevation or colder regions, there are times when Christmas rose grown in Kanto in a greenhouse are shipped to those areas, right? And this area is relatively warm, and it gets sent to colder regions. Then it's sold indoors at a shop. If they buy something like that, can they just set it outside right away? It's a bit risky. It'll droop right away, right? Christmas rose is resilient, but it still needs to be acclimated. Just like how you'll be shocked if you went from a warm place to a cold place, they need to be gradually acclimated as well. Gradually acclimated to the coldness of your home. So you want to bring it inside during the night and go back and forth over a week or two to gradually. You have to acclimate gradually. The ones sold in Kanto may come from a warm place, or ones from growers in Tohoku. They're grown in greenhouses because it snows there, so they're grown in warm places. They live in a sheltered life, and then it goes out to the world, so if it's not acclimated, it's very risky. Right. And Christmas rose is something, although inexpensive, they still start at a few thousand yen, so flower shops don't usually leave them outside either. They're usually sold indoors. So if you buy that and put it outside in the frost right away, thinking they're tough, you can ruin it. Right. So you want to bring it inside during the night, and preferably start it under the eaves as you acclimate it gradually. Preferably, yes. Related to that, growing them in greenhouses like this means there isn't much wind, and it's warmer. So there's a tendency for it to grow taller. This one is this tall, of course. It was shorter when it started blooming. Once they go to everyone's homes, it'll probably half as tall next year because it's cold. It'll probably get this tall when it gets warmer. If the appearance of the plant changes the year after you buy it, that's the reason why. The roof, it's like growing under an umbrella. Good or bad, it's like bean sprouts and bean stalks growing in full sun look completely different. That's part of it. I think those who watch this point must really love Christmas Rose. So here's a hidden tidbit for the end. You know people saying, when I bought it, the flowers were a beautiful pale pink, but when it bloomed the second year, it's a deeper pink. I think that's very common. The color changing. Why does the color change? One is that it's like when I said earlier, if they grow in a warm place, they become like green sprouts. There's a tendency for the colors to come out thinner, like it's under an umbrella or insulated. Just being in a greenhouse makes it a lot more likely to turn whiter because it's like wearing sunscreen. That's one. Another is that at people's homes, they blossom gradually under cold conditions, so they tend to come out with deeper colors. That's another. Also, when the flowers are blooming, if you have a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, this part that looks like flower petals called calyx is essentially a petal. They tend to get thicker. It's like a part of the leaves, and yes, it gets thicker or it gets a deeper color as it tries to return to green. So it has those tendencies. It's fine if everyone allowed nature to take its course, but inevitably you have people who have a desire to control that. In that case, you might be able to get the same color if you create the same environment, but there's definitely a tendency for the color to turn deeper. I think it's inevitable. If you want a lighter color, you might be able to bring it inside during the night, or put it outside a little later, or maybe put plastic over it. Just blocking the wind will get it to grow taller, or you can ever so slightly block the light, or put a white cheesecloth over it or something. If you put a thin cheesecloth or something, and just blocking the frost will get it taller. You do have that. Now, when you protect it from frost, should you start when the buds start coming in? Starting at the beginning will help it grow easier, faster, and taller. It'll grow taller and have lighter flowers. I see. This was on the long side, but Mr. Yokoyama, thank you very much. Thank you. Here at Gekihana, there are probably topics you may not have understood. Regarding those, if you go to the line link in the description below and register online, you can ask me questions. As you can see, Mr. Yokoyama and I are buds, so if there are questions I can't answer, I can always reach out to him and get those answers. If you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful, please hit like. I'd really appreciate that. I will be visiting growers like this to make more videos in the future, so if you want to be notified, please subscribe. Thank you very much for watching today. Please watch again.